Welcome back to the Next Brave Step podcast. Today, I have such an inspiring guest joining us. I have Oli DeBoer. She goes by Oli. She's a brand new podcaster, a social worker, and a new mom who is balancing it all while diving deep into some really important conversations. Oli is a co-host of the podcast Dirty Laundry with Oli and M. It is a show that really creates space for people to share their stories, the real, the raw, the unfiltered ones. So in this episode, we're talking all about why so many of us keep parts of our story hidden, how vulnerability leads to healing, and what it really takes to launch something meaningful, whether it's a podcast, a business, or a new adventure. Oli shares her own journey of starting a podcast, how she's holding space for others, and why storytelling is such a powerful tool for connection and growth. If you've ever felt like your story wasn't worth telling, or you really hesitated on taking those next steps towards something new, this episode is for you. Stay tuned until the end because Oli has some incredible wisdom to share about pushing past fear and just going for it. All right, let's dive in. I'm so excited. I have Oli DeBoer on the podcast today. So thank you for coming on the show. I'm so excited to have you on. How about we start off with just a quick introduction of who you are and what you do.
Absolutely. So my name is Oli DeBoer. I'm a wife and a mommy, and my son is how many weeks? He's 6 weeks old. So very, very new. So for my day job, I do foster care licensing. I work with level 5 foster care. So there's different levels. Level 1 is like a kinship care. So if you're working with licensing someone who is taking care of a relative, and then with each level, the intensity of care gets a little bit more intense. So for level 5, I work with individuals who would otherwise be potentially placed in like a residential facility. So we create homes that are curated specifically for the child that's being placed. So currently on maternity leave, which has been the best thing ever, but we'll be going back in March. And then I graduated from UW-Milwaukee with a degree in social work and graphic design. And so I've been in the field for a couple of years now. Really, really love it. I did an internship at a hospital near here, worked in their sexual assault department. So I worked with individuals who've been through domestic violence and sexual assault. I worked in the emergency department, was an advocate there. And then in January, I launched my podcast. So that's a little bit about me.
Love that. Okay. So I found you through your podcast. I was like scrolling through Apple Podcasts, just like looking for new podcasts that had come out and just kind of seeing what all was out there. So your podcast is like brand new, like almost a month old now, right? Like just barely. Okay.
Yeah.
Whatever. So exciting.
Yeah. Tomorrow will be a month old.
It's like a little birthday for it or something.
Absolutely.
So go ahead and tell us a little bit about your podcast, the ideas behind the podcast. Your podcast is called Dirty Laundry and you have a co-host as well. But go ahead and show us what inspired you to start the podcast and a little bit behind the name of it, because that was just so ingenious. I love it.
I love it. Thank you. So to listen, you search Dirty Laundry with Oli and M. I wanted to start a brand about 4 years ago. It was kind of playing with a bunch of ideas. Because of my design background, I wanted to do something a little bit more creative. I wanted to do something with storytelling, and I wasn't 100% sure how to kind of make it come to fruition. And after thinking about it quite a bit, I decided to start with the podcast. So naming the podcast, I named it Dirty Laundry because I think it's so important to remember that we all have a story. And so often we look at our lives and there's so much shame behind, that shame relating to our story, depending on whatever we've walked through. And I named it Dirty Laundry because we all have a story and we all have dirty laundry. I feel like I'm not articulating this great, but I wanted people to, I wanted to build a collaborative community to encourage people to share and not be embarrassed by the things that they've walked through. Mm-hmm. So the podcast itself, is released in seasons. So the first 3 seasons are childhood healing and development, sexual assault, and moral injury. And then I'm going to do the 4th season will be fertility. But I bring on storytellers to talk about their experience. So, for example, in season 1, I have a lady coming on, or that came on, to talk about her experience with their son who has epilepsy. I have another lady that came on to talk about her son who has a few different mental health diagnoses. And then his father ended up getting shot when he was 10 years old, and just talking about how she learned to love her son really well and support him through that, and just through the different things that he has experienced. And then I brought another couple who talk about their experience with their son who has autism. So I want to bring on people who are super relatable, who are still kind of in the grid of it and not fully actualized. I feel like so often we listen to these stories and it's like they have arrived. Not that I believe anyone has arrived, but that you're looking at their life and it's like they've already been through it. How can I even relate to a person that has already succeeded? So I want to bring on people who there's like so much beauty and joy and growth in their story, but they're still in the midst of it. Like all these parents are still like learning how to love their kid and support their kid, and every season is new. So one of people that I felt I could relate to it in some way, and I could learn from. And then to support those stories, I bring on clinicians to talk about different resources. So for the childhood healing and development, I bring on an occupational therapist, and I bring on someone to talk about TBRI, which is trust-based relational intervention. And I mean, just talking about how, like, one of the biggest conversations was that behavior is communication. So often we look at behavior as something that's really negative. But for example, like with my little 6-month-old, I mean, he's crying and people are like, oh, baby, your baby's so grouchy, or, why are you crying? And it's like, he has no other way to communicate. And it's the same with children who maybe haven't learned how to appropriately communicate. And so it's going to come out in behavior. The people that I brought on are just so intelligent and are able to just explain things extremely, extremely well. And I think it's a conversation that needs to be had.
I love that. Part of this podcast, like the next brave step, was just taking like that next step forward, and like, you're never arrived at whatever the end point is. It's always changing, right? And that's the beauty of
Totally.
life and all things. I connect with you loving that part of it as well. Definitely different modalities of it, but it's like the same like through line, and I love that. So you talk a little bit about how, there's often a lot of shame around different parts of our stories that maybe we're not so proud of, or have been conditioned to think that we shouldn't share so much about it. Like, why do you think that is that we can often be so afraid to air those parts of our lives? I'm guessing you've read some of Brene Brown's work on shame. I'm interested, I guess, to kind of hear your take on why often we hide our dirty laundry in the back of our closet instead of talking about it when we all have dirty laundry.
Let's see. I feel like it's so different for everybody. I think everybody keeps their story hidden for lots of different reasons. For just fear of rejection, I think is a really big thing. Like with my story, the reason I started dirty laundry was I felt like through sharing my story, I found a lot of healing. 3 years ago, I was sexually assaulted and went through the therapy and the criminal justice process, and I went to trial, and I did the whole 9 yards. Throughout the whole process, I was really open about what I was experiencing when I was walking through, and it brought a lot of healing in my life. And I was able to relate to a ton of people. Like in this specific scenario, like 1 in 3 women are assaulted. So, I mean, when it happens to you, you're able to relate to a lot of people in that community. And I think that, I guess the society that we've grown up in and that we live in, like with social media, everything is like picture perfect, and we're putting out our best self. And that is like what we're trying to achieve that. it's so unrealistic. And so I think it's because of the society that we live in that we're told to be a specific way, and it's so not the truth. We're all broken. And or maybe not broken. I don't think that we're broken people, but I think that we're like a mirror, and there's places that are a little bit shattered and need support and need love. And when we're willing to be vulnerable and share, I think it gives other people the space to do the same. And I think that's why storytelling is just so beautiful.
I love that. So the podcast is pretty new. We said, it's only about a month old. Have you already started to see like any impact in maybe your own lives or like reactions from listeners in how the podcast is kind of changing conversations or opening doors? I'd love to hear like what's that impact been even only a month in?
Yeah. So I guess my goal in the podcast right now is just because it is so small and so new. I think we've had like over 200 listeners. So it's like had a good amount of traction, but definitely, super, super new. My goal right now is to reach the people that I'm bringing on the podcast and just creating the platform for them to share. So that is my first goal and my first mission is to bring healing to the people that I'm bringing on. Like I said, sharing my story was so healing that my goal of creating the podcast was to create just a platform for others to come on and be able to share theirs and be their story and be able to just like be empowered to share. So I've had such good feedback from the individuals that have come on the podcast, and just very real, and it's very raw, very much not a perfectionist. And when I podcast, I'm very laid back and just like truly just want to get to know people and have a conversation with people and have them feel heard. Because I feel like so often we live in a society again that we're just like, we try to make ourselves so small. And I just want to like remind people that their story is so important. And one of the storytellers reached out to me. Her episode launched on Tuesday. And she was just like, thank you. Like, thank you so much. I didn't realize that being sharing my story was going to have the impact that it has had. She's like, I feel so empowered and just so excited for how my story is going to potentially help encourage somebody else. And then even when I reach out to people and ask them to come on the podcast, I've had really good feedback just asking, because for the moral injury season, I interview veterans, and one of the questions I asked was like, what are questions that have been helpful in like the healing process, and like as a veteran, what can I ask you to help support you? And they were like, honestly, like nobody has ever really asked. And one of the veterans was like, this is the first time somebody has asked to hear my story. And so, I mean, right now, like I said, my goal is just in the people that I'm interviewing. And then I'm hoping that there will be a ripple effect.
Well, I'm sure there will definitely be a ripple effect as it goes on. I think that's one thing I love about podcast is like podcasting and blogging. Social media is great, I think, but I think blogging and podcasting creates this longevity for these conversations to last and people to stumble over them years down the road when, they're searching for, help to that certain topic. So right. I think that you have deciding to do this as a podcast platform, I think is very powerful. And I'm so excited to watch as it grows and evolves over the years. You have many years ahead for this podcast, and I can't wait to watch it grow.
Thank you so much.
Has there been what has been the most surprising or unexpected part of launching the podcast, either in like the process of it or the conversations that you've had?
It is way harder than I expected it to be. I kind of look at podcasters and I was like, oh yeah, anyone could do that. And then I started putting things together and I was like, oh my gosh, obviously any creative endeavor has its ups and downs, and it was like really challenging figuring out all the different, like the RSS feed. What the heck is an RSS feed? And then I didn't.
You only have to do it that like one time.
Right. But I was like Googling, I was like, how do you create an RSS feed? But I mean, obviously I found out, through Spotify. I use Spotify for podcasters. It shows, it's created for you. But But it was just like way more challenging and kind of like isolating too. Like I was super stoked about it and was putting hours and hours and hours of work in. Like I created my podcast, cover, I guess you'd call it. I designed all that, and I designed my website, and I batched a ton of like Instagram posts, and I'd been working on it for like a year, and I was kind of losing a lot of steam. I was like, I'm not seeing anything come from this yet. But then once I launched, it was like, okay, this is so worth it. All the time I put into this is so worth it. And then on the topical side, some of the conversations are really, really heavy. And so eventually I'm planning on going back for my master's this fall, and I would love to eventually be a therapist. So it's honestly a really good learning opportunity for me to hear someone's story, to empathize with it, but then not necessarily bring it home with me. But some of the stories are really, really heavy. So it's learning, like I just said, learning to empathize and love someone right where they're at. But then I would say I'm an empath. I don't have to take it on. I don't have to make their problem my problem. I could be there for them and support them, and then, be able to also, separate myself from that. So yeah. I would say those are the two most challenging things.
It sounds like it. I love that you're being so honest, I guess, in like the highlights and the lowlights of it, because starting anything new, whether it's a business or like a healing journey or a podcast, like it's so easy to just like talk to people about like what's going right and showcasing like everything that's like the triumph of it instead of showing like the valleys of it. And I think that there's definitely power in showing both, which obviously you understand with your podcast. So I just wanted to thank you for being honest with that part of it. You talked a little bit about like the emotional weight of these deep conversations and holding space. It's kind of like this huge responsibility. Is there anything that you're doing like specifically to take care of yourself emotionally while you're encouraging others? You've got a background in foster care licensings, which means you work very closely with people that are carrying some very deep and personal stories. Has that experience kind of influenced your approach to how you're doing all of this with the podcast as well?
So in some ways, for my job, I have to interview the foster parents and pretty much ask them about every little nitty gritty thing that's ever happened to them. So there's definitely interviewing in both scenarios. But regarding things that I do for myself, I'm also a boxing coach and a group fitness instructor. I do CrossFit. So that's definitely a way that I kind of, burn off some energy, some steam. I'm religious. I'm a Christian, so that is also a really big part of my story, and definitely where I find a lot of hope and a lot of peace. And I would say those are probably the two biggest things. Like I have a super, super supportive husband and family and friends. I would say those are the things that I lean on.
I love that. So what's your vision for the Dirty Laundry podcast over the next year? It sounds like you have put so much work into the back end of stuff and getting things planned, like planning stuff out and batching and scheduling and all of that. So you've got a pretty good runway of all the things that you've kind of built out, and you're starting to see that kind of come to fruition. But
Totally.
What do you hope that this podcast looks like a year from now?
So I was writing out my goals for the year. I would love to drop 2 merch items. So I'm currently working on designing 2 merch items. I guess. But so I'm working on the designs right now, and I'm hoping to launch them like by the end of the summer into the fall. And then just continue being consistent with podcasting. Like, as you know, with podcasting, the most important thing is consistency and building the listeners. So I launch every Tuesday morning or when my podcasts come out. My plan is to continue doing once a week. I have 24 episodes batched, and then I think I'll start interviewing again in like April. So I have it batched out to the end of May. I have episodes created for that, and then just continuing to create. I'm hoping to make it a little bit more interactive as I create episodes kind of as they come up versus batching a really big block. So putting out a little bit more questions, like talking to the community a little bit more and trying to have them be a little bit more involved in the questions that I ask the individuals in the interview, so that people who are listening can get their questions answered, and just kind of, like I said, be a part of the conversation. Eventually, my goal is, as I hopefully get more of a fan base, to, like, as potentially money starts coming in with merch, that with each topic, I would start making products for each season. So if it's a season relating to sexual assault, I would create a sweatshirt or a hat or a pants or whatever that relate to that specific topic. And then a part of those proceeds would go towards an organization that works with individuals who have been through sexual assault or something along those lines. And same with like firefighters and veterans. Like, I would create a product that goes along with that season, and then whatever merch gets sold, part of those proceeds would go. And then my hope too is that all of the people who I interview in that season would have a say in where those funds are going. So I would kind of have a poll, like, what are some organizations that you're really passionate about? And then based on what those people or what my interviewees say, then that's where those funds would go. So that's a kind of long-term goal. I would love to start my own private practice and do therapy. So my podcast, this is big goal, big vision. Who knows what happens, but the podcast would be more macro work. So working in like those larger communities, making that larger impact. And then I would have my micro work be that therapy, that one-on-one therapy. So that's big vision right now. Again, I'm just trying to impact the interviewees that come with my podcast and try to just, again, love people where they're at and love people really well, but also working towards those goals.
I love that. I love that you have that big future vision. So important to have those while you're building out things so that you can prepare for, what that is going to look like. And I love the idea of merch for each season. I think that's a very unique idea, and I can't wait to see what merch you drop in this summer. So you talked a little bit about community and having this kind of two-way conversation. So are you doing that through social media? Do you have a Facebook group? Do you have an email newsletter? How are you, where's this conversation, I guess, taking place?
So right now I'm just on Instagram. You can find me at Dirty Laundry Podcast. Eventually I would love to have a newsletter that I send out via email, but I decided just to start out a little bit smaller and kind of hone in on Instagram and get a following there, and then start branching out. I'm going to start meeting with a business professional to help kind of strategize and how to best reach people. But right now, just building up the Instagram, and then as time goes on, I'll start kind of branching out to other things.
So where you said, what's the podcast or the Instagram handle again, so everyone can come follow you and join in the conversation?
Absolutely. It's Dirty Laundry Podcast. And then the podcast is on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and it's Dirty Laundry with Olli and
All right. Is there anything else that you would like to, or I guess any advice that you would give to any other listeners who are maybe getting ready to start a new adventure, whether it's starting a new podcast, launching a new business, going into a new season of life? What advice would you have for someone who is on the precipice of this next chapter?
I would say just do it. Show up in your raw and messy in whatever form. Someone told me once that nobody listens to your first 20 podcasts, and maybe that's offensive. People are like, oh, well, that wasn't super encouraging. But honestly, it took such a weight off my shoulders. I was like, great. I am not the best interviewee. I'm not the best interviewer. The fact that I wasn't going to have a ton of listeners, I was like, awesome. I hope people find me when I'm on episode 40, 50, 60, and I'm a little bit more actualized, but just show up. And if I feel for me, I was afraid to launch my podcast because I thought that it was silly I was like, this is kind of a silly thing and very trendy. Like, people are just starting a podcast and wanting to be an entrepreneur on all of this. But I realized that the only people that are potentially making fun or think it's silly are the ones who maybe aren't doing a whole lot themselves. And I feel like the people that have arrived and the people who are doing something with their lives are going to encourage and are going to build you up and like be excited for you. And the people who are going to be a little bit maybe more discouraging are maybe the people that want to be where you are. So just do it. And who cares what anyone thinks about you, because truly it doesn't matter. So that I would say is my advice.
I love it. I think there's so many entrepreneurs who end up stealing the tagline from Nike of just do it, because it's simple, but it is powerful. And
Absolutely.
I love it. So I have one last question for you. It's a question that I ask every single one of my guests, and it's kind of a goofy one, but that's okay. And that is, if you were a plant, what plant would you be and why? I'm kind of a plant geek. I love all the plants.
I love it. I would be a poppy. I have a poppy tattoo on my arm. And I was going through a really, really hard time in 2019. And I was in Europe, and I was on a hike. And everywhere that I was hiking, I saw poppy plants. So it was like in a field, but then they were in the rocks. And it was like in like the grossest places. It was like, there's still a poppy. And I was like, that is who and what I want to be. I want to be a poppy. I want to be someone who can grow in the beauty. And when it's like, there's rain and it's like sunny and just this beautiful place. But then I also want to be someone who can grow in the rocks and in the gross. To answer your question, I would be a poppy.
Oh, I love it. A specific color?
I love the orange poppies.
Orange ones are pretty. Love it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Olli, for joining me on this podcast. We will make sure that we have the links to all of the places that people can find you down in the show notes below. Thank you for joining me today, and we'll see everyone in the next episode.
Thank you so much for having me.
It was such incredible conversation with Olli. I loved how she's creating a space where people can share their stories without shame, and she's really proving that we don't have to have everything all figured out in order to make an impact. Her journey is such a reminder that showing up, even in the mess, is the key to growth, not just for ourselves, but for people that we're meant to serve. Olli, if you are listening, keep going. Your vision for Dirty Laundry is so powerful, and I have no doubt that it is going to continue to make an impact in ways that we can't even see yet. For all of you listening, if you are on the edge of starting something new, whether it's a podcast, a business, or just stepping into a new chapter of life, go ahead and take Olli's advice. Just do it. The people who matter to you will support you, and the ones who don't, they're not your people anyways. Thank you guys so much for being here with me today. Be sure you check out the show notes below for all the ways to connect with Olli and her podcast. And if this episode resonates with you, go ahead and share it with someone. If this episode resonates with you, send me a message or share it with a friend who needs to hear it. Keep taking those brave steps every day, and I will see you in the next episode. Love you. Bye.